Picture a hill above Boston Harbor on the night of June the 16th, 1775. A column of men moves up a slope of pasture and ryegrass in the dark, carrying picks and shovels instead of muskets, under orders to dig before the sun comes up. By morning, a British warship in the harbor spots the raw earth of a freshly cut redoubt and opens fire. What follows the next afternoon becomes one of the bloodiest single actions of the entire Revolutionary War, a fight remembered as the Battle of Bunker Hill, though most of it was fought on the slope beside it, a rise called Breed's Hill. Fewer than 1,500 colonial militiamen held that ground against a British force nearly twice their number, and when the day ended, the British had taken the hill but lost more men doing it than in any battle they would fight in the entire war. The names of the men who stood behind that rail fence and inside that redoubt were written into militia rolls, pension records, and church registers across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. 14 of those surnames still turn up constantly in the family trees of people living in New England today. If your name is one of them, there is a real chance your line runs straight back to that hillside. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why 14 surnames from one afternoon still matter 250 years later, you have to understand what Boston looked like in the spring of 1775. British troops had occupied the city since the previous year, and after the fighting at Lexington and Concord in April, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded Boston in what became known as the siege. These were not professional soldiers. They were farmers, fishermen, tradesmen, and shopkeepers who had grabbed a musket and a powder horn and walked to the edge of town, organized loosely by county and by town company, answering to colonels who were often their own neighbors, men they had grown up beside, worked beside, and in some cases argued with at town meeting the year before. When word reached the Massachusetts Committee of Safety that the British intended to fortify the high ground overlooking Boston, the Colonial Command decided to move first. On the night of June the 16th, roughly 1,000 men marched onto the Charlestown Peninsula under Colonel William Prescott, with orders to fortify Bunker Hill. For reasons historians still debate, they dug in instead on the lower rise of Breed's Hill, close enough to Boston that the British could not ignore it. What happened over the following hours turned a defensive earthwork into a proving ground for entire family lines. Regiments from a dozen Massachusetts towns filled the redoubt and the rail fence that ran down to the water. Connecticut sent companies under officers who had marched north the moment the alarm reached them, some covering close to 100 miles in a matter of days. New Hampshire men crossed the Mystic River to reinforce a rail fence stacked with hay that would become the deadliest stretch of ground on the field. The British assaulted that line 3 times, in tight formation, in wool coats, in June heat, and were cut down twice before finally taking the redoubt on the 3rd charge, mostly because the defenders had run out of powder rather than because their aim or their nerve had failed them. Genealogical and historical societies across New England, including the Sons of the American Revolution, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and dozens of town historical archives, have spent 2 centuries cataloging exactly who stood on that hill. Muster rolls survive, pension applications survive, many of them filed decades later by aging veterans or their widows, describing in their own words what they carried, where they stood, and what they saw. Those records are the reason we can still trace 14 surnames back to a single June afternoon with real confidence, not folklore passed down at family reunions. The British side of the ledger tells its own part of the story, and it helps explain why the colonial defenders held out as long as they did. British regiments crossed the harbor in open boats and formed up in full view of the hill, in wool coats built for a European winter, carrying packs loaded with 60 pounds of equipment across ground that had been recently mowed for hay and was strewn with fences and stone walls never meant to be crossed under fire. Officers who survived the assault later wrote that the fire from the rail fence and the redoubt was heavier and better aimed than anything they had expected from what they had dismissed beforehand as an untrained rabble. That misjudgment cost them dearly. Entire companies of British regulars were cut down in the space of a few minutes during the first 2 assaults, and some regiments lost the majority of their officers before the day was through. It took a 3rd and final charge, made after the defenders' powder had all but run out, for the British to finally clear the redoubt, and even then the retreat off the peninsula happened only because there was nothing left to fight with, not because the men holding that line had lost their nerve. It helps to understand how loosely organized these regiments actually were, because it explains why the same surnames repeat so often through the rolls. A colonial militia regiment in 1775 was not drawn from across a whole colony at random. It was raised town by town, sometimes almost household by household, so an entire company might be made up of men who had grown up on the same road, married into the same handful of families, and worshipped in the same meeting house every Sunday of their lives. When a colonel like Prescott or Stark called out his regiment, he was in a real sense calling out an extended kinship network, cousins and brothers-in-law and neighbors who had known each other's fathers. That is part of why certain surnames cluster so heavily around certain regiments, and why genealogists today can often place a family with real precision once they know which company an ancestor served in. The pension files that survive from the early 1800s, when Congress finally began paying out benefits to aging Revolutionary veterans, add another layer of detail, because clerks recorded not just names but ages, physical descriptions, old wounds, and the testimony of neighbors who had known the applicant for 50 years and could vouch that yes, this was the same man who had stood at the rail fence as a young man in 1775. The way these names were written down matters too, because spelling in 1775 was never as fixed as it is now. A town clerk recording a muster roll by candlelight might spell the same family name 3 different ways across 3 different pages, depending on how the man in front of him pronounced it and how tired the clerk's hand was by the end of the evening. Bridge sometimes appears as Bridges, Frye sometimes appears as Frye, Knowlton occasionally shows up as Knowlton in older documents, and Pomeroy has been recorded, at various points, as Pomeroy or Pomeroy by clerks who were clearly working from sound rather than any fixed standard. None of this is unusual for the period, and none of it should discourage anyone tracing a family line. But it does mean that researchers working through original militia rolls need to read a little loosely, checking variant spellings rather than searching for one exact string of letters. The core sound of the name almost always survives even when the spelling drifts, and that sound is usually enough to connect a modern family to the entry a tired clerk scratched into a ledger 250 years ago. Number 14, Little. Colonel Moses Little led a regiment raised largely out of Newbury and the towns along the Massachusetts coast north of Boston. His men were among the reinforcements who crossed onto the peninsula as the fighting intensified, and the Little name appears repeatedly through the pension files of Essex County militiamen who later swore under oath that they had served under him at the rail fence. Several of those depositions describe long marches through the night to reach the peninsula before the fighting reached its worst point, arriving winded and thirsty to a line that was already taking fire. The name itself is Old English, originally a simple physical description passed down through generations of Massachusetts farming families long before any of them had reason to think it would end up on a battlefield roll. Casualties on both sides overwhelmed whatever medical care existed that day. Wounded men were carried or dragged back across the narrow neck of the peninsula under fire, since it was the only route off the battlefield, and more than one veteran's later account describes crossing that strip of land while grape shot from a British ship in the harbor tore up the ground around them. Doctors on the Colonial side had little more than what a country town could supply, and many of the wounded who survived the battle carried the physical marks of it for the rest of their lives, a detail that shows up again and again in the pension files. Old soldiers in their 70s describing a leg that never fully healed, or a hand that never closed all the way, injuries taken as young men on a hillside above Boston and carried quietly for the next 50 years. Number 13, Chester. Captain John Chester marched his Connecticut company north from Wethersfield the moment news of the fighting reached the colony, and local tradition holds that his men arrived turned out in matching uniforms, a rare and almost startling sight among militia companies who mostly wore whatever they owned. Chester's company took up a position near the rail fence during the height of the fighting, and later accounts from his own men describe the strange contrast between their neat coats and the chaos unfolding around them once the British lines began to advance. The name Chester traces to the English city of the same name, and it moved through Connecticut River Valley families for generations before that company marched north in the summer of 1775. Number 12, Bunker. This one is different from the rest because it did not arrive at the battle. It was already there. The hill itself took its name from George Bunker, an early Charlestown settler whose family had held land on that rise since the 1630s, more than a century before the fighting. By the time the battle came, the Bunker name had spread through the peninsula's oldest families, farmers and shipwrights whose deeds and land grants filled the Charlestown town records long before any redcoat set foot there. The hill carried their name into every history book written afterward, even though most of the fighting that day happened on the neighboring slope the family did not own, a detail that still trips up visitors looking for the actual battlefield today. Later generations of the Bunker family stayed in the Charlestown area well after the war, and their name appears in property records and town meeting minutes long after the fighting had passed into memory. A reminder that some families connected to that day never had to travel anywhere to be part of the story. Number 11, Bridge. Colonel Ebenezer Bridge commanded a Massachusetts regiment drawn from Middlesex County, the same farming country west of Boston that had sent men to Lexington and Concord only weeks earlier. Bridge's regiment took heavy losses in the fighting near the rail fence, and Bridge himself was among the many colonial officers whose service records show them present for the entire siege of Boston that followed, not just the single afternoon that made the battle famous. Town records from Billerica and the surrounding villages list Bridge family men appearing in militia roles going back to the founding of those towns, a lineage of local service that predated the Revolution by 100 years. The surname is a simple English place name, common across the colonial Massachusetts towns that filled out his regiment's ranks. Number 10, Nixon. Colonel John Nixon led a regiment of Massachusetts men and was wounded during the fighting, one of dozens of colonial officers who came off that hill bleeding but alive. Nixon recovered and went on to serve through much of the war, eventually rising to brigadier general in the Continental Army, though the wound he took at Bunker Hill reportedly troubled him for years afterward. Pension records from his old regiment describe the confusion of the retreat off the peninsula once the powder ran out, men falling back past the wounded, carrying what weapons they could and leaving behind what they could not. Nixon's surname is Scots and Northern English in origin, and it had already taken root across several Massachusetts counties by the time his regiment mustered for the fight. Number 9, Brewer. Colonel Jonathan Brewer raised a regiment that fought near the rail fence alongside Stark's and Knowlton's men, in the stretch of ground that absorbed the worst of the British assaults. Brewer's own service extended well beyond that single day, and town records from his home area document a family that had farmed the same land for multiple generations before the war interrupted everything, sons and grandsons working the same fields their grandfathers had cleared. The surname is occupational, describing an ancestor who brewed ale or beer, one of the oldest and most common trade names to cross the Atlantic with English settlers in the 1600s, carried by households who took up the name generations before anyone in the family still brewed anything for a living. Number 8, Frye. Colonel James Frye commanded a regiment recruited largely from Andover and the surrounding Essex County towns. Frye was in poor health by the time of the battle, and reportedly directed much of his regiment's movement from a sickbed nearby, while his men fought under subordinate officers on the line, a detail that appears in more than one account left by veterans of his regiment years later. The Frye name descends from Norman French roots that entered England after the conquest, and by the 1700s it had spread through generations of Massachusetts farming families with no memory left of its continental origin. Number 7, Knowlton. Captain Thomas Knowlton commanded a detachment of Connecticut troops posted at a stone and rail fence that connected the main line to the beach, a position that became one of the most contested pieces of ground on the entire field. Knowlton's men held that fence through repeated assaults, and Knowlton himself survived the battle only to be killed the following year, at Harlem Heights, by then commanding an early reconnaissance unit that some historians consider a forerunner of American military intelligence. The Knowlton surname traces to a place name in the north of England, and it had already spread through Connecticut river towns for 3 generations before the war carried it into the history books. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Number 6, Gridley. Richard Gridley served as the chief engineer for the colonial forces and personally designed the redoubt on Breed's Hill, laying it out in the dark hours of June the 16th so that by dawn the British would find a fortified position where none had existed the night before. Gridley was wounded during the fighting and continued serving through the siege of Boston, later becoming the senior engineer of the entire Continental Army, a role that put his hand on fortifications up and down the eastern seaboard for years after that single night's work above Charlestown. His work that night, an earthwork thrown up in a matter of hours under threat of discovery, shaped the entire course of the battle before a single shot had been fired, buying the defenders on the hill enough cover to hold against 2 full assaults. The Gridley name had been established in Massachusetts since the 1600s, carried by a family of surveyors and builders whose skills, it turned out, the colony needed most on the one night it mattered. Gridley's own sons went on to serve in the artillery through later years of the war, carrying the same eye for ground and angle that had shaped their father's redoubt on Breed's Hill. Number 5, Pomeroy. Seth Pomeroy was already an old man by militia standards, close to 70 years old, when he rode toward the sound of the fighting on a borrowed horse, rather than stay behind with a commission that would have kept him off the field entirely. Pomeroy had fought decades earlier in the French and Indian War, and his presence at Bunker Hill, an aging veteran shouldering a musket beside men young enough to be his grandsons, became one of the enduring images of the battle for the generation that followed, retold in local histories well into the following century. The Pomeroy family had been established in Massachusetts since the earliest colonial period, and its name descends from a place in Normandy, carried into England after the conquest, and then across the Atlantic more than 5 centuries later, ending up in the hands of a man who by 1775 had already outlived most of his own contemporaries. Number 4. Stark. Colonel John Stark led New Hampshire troops across the Mystic River and positioned them at the rail fence, where he reportedly placed a stake in the ground roughly 40 yards in front of his line and ordered his men not to fire until the British crossed it. That stretch of fence held against repeated assaults and inflicted some of the heaviest casualties of the entire battle, a fact British officers themselves noted in reports written after the fighting had ended. Stark went on to fight through the rest of the war and later gave New Hampshire its state motto, the words "Live free or die," taken from a letter he wrote decades afterward when age kept him from attending a reunion of old veterans. Pension files from his old regiment, filed by aging soldiers well into the 1800s, still describe the discipline of that line at the rail fence as the reason the British paid so dearly for the ground they eventually took. Number 3. Putnam. Israel Putnam arrived on the peninsula already a legend in New England, a Connecticut farmer and veteran of earlier colonial wars whose exploits, including a famous story about crawling into a wolf's den to kill it, had made him a household name before the Revolution even began. Putnam was present organizing troops and moving between positions during the battle, though historians have long debated exactly what command role he held that day compared to Prescott, since surviving accounts from participants sometimes conflict on details as basic as where he stood during the final assault. What is not in dispute is that Putnam's presence steadied men who had never faced organized infantry before, and his name appears throughout the pensioned testimony of veterans who remembered, decades later, an old soldier moving calmly through the chaos while shot tore up the grass around him, seemingly unbothered by fire that sent younger men diving for cover. Connecticut town histories written a century later still leaned on Putnam's presence at the battle as a point of local pride, proof that their militia had answered the call to Massachusetts without hesitation the moment word of the fighting reached them. Number 2. Prescott. Colonel William Prescott commanded the men inside the redoubt on Breed's Hill and is generally credited with the order that has echoed through American memory ever since, an instruction to hold fire until the attacking British were close enough to see clearly, a way of conserving scarce powder against an enemy advancing in tight formation across open ground. Prescott stayed on the parapet through the worst of the fighting, reportedly walking the length of the earthwork in full view of the British to steady his men's nerve even as musket balls struck the dirt around his feet, and he was among the last to leave once the ammunition ran out and the position became impossible to hold. Prescott survived the battle and continued serving through the siege of Boston, his coolness under fire that afternoon becoming one of the most repeated stories among the veterans who had watched him do it. His descendants carried the family name through New England for generations, and Pepperell, Massachusetts, the town he called home, still marks his service in its local records to this day. Number 1. Warren. Dr. Joseph Warren held no formal command that day. He was the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and had just been commissioned a major general days before the battle, a rank that would have kept most men safely behind the lines directing strategy from a distance rather than standing in the line of fire. Warren chose instead to fight as a volunteer private, taking up a musket and standing shoulder to shoulder with the men in the redoubt rather than issuing orders from the rear, a decision his friends reportedly tried and failed to talk him out of before the fighting began. He was killed in the final British assault, shot as the position was being overrun, and his body was not identified with certainty for months afterward, buried in haste in the chaos of the retreat before being properly recovered. Warren's death shocked the colonies. He had been a physician, a political organizer, and by most accounts one of the most persuasive voices for independence in Massachusetts, and his willingness to die as an ordinary soldier, rather than direct the battle from safety, turned him into one of the most mourned figures of the entire war. Genealogical societies across New England still trace descent from Warren family lines with particular care, given how abruptly and how young his own life ended on that hillside, at only 34 years old. 14 names one afternoon, and a casualty count that still startles people who look it up for the first time. The British took the hill but lost more than 1,000 men doing it, nearly half their attacking force, while Colonial losses ran closer to 450. It was, by any strict measure, a defeat for the Colonial side, since the British held the ground when the smoke finally cleared and the fires in Charlestown burned themselves out that evening. But it proved something that mattered more than the ground itself, that farmers and tradesmen organized into hasty militia companies could stand against the finest infantry in the world and make them bleed for every single yard of a hillside pasture. That lesson traveled through the rest of the war in the same pension records and family Bibles that carried these 14 surnames down through the generations that followed, copied by hand from one family record into the next, until they reached archives that still hold them today. If Little, Chester, Bunker, Bridge, Nixon, Brewer, Frye, Knowlton, Gridley, Pomeroy, Stark, Putnam, Prescott, or Warren appears anywhere in your family tree, town and county archives across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire are still the place to start looking, alongside the pension files at the National Archives that so many of these veterans, or their widows, filed decades after the smoke had cleared from that hillside above Boston. Local historical societies in towns like Pepperell, Andover, Newbury, and Wethersfield still hold original militia rolls and church records that predate the battle by generations, the same documents that let modern researchers connect a name in a family Bible to a specific company that stood on that hill. For many families, the paper trail is thinner the further back it runs, but for these 14 names, the record is unusually complete, preserved by a country that never stopped being proud of what happened on that hillside on a single afternoon in June. That completeness is worth pausing on, because it is not an accident. Within a few decades of the battle, veterans themselves understood they had taken part in something the country would want remembered, and many sat for interviews with early historians, wrote out their own accounts for local newspapers, or simply talked long enough at town gatherings that someone else wrote it down for them. When the Federal Pension Acts of the 1820s and 1830s finally offered payment to aging Revolutionary veterans, thousands of old soldiers, by then in their 70s and 80s, walked into county courthouses to swear affidavits describing where they had stood and what they remembered. Those affidavits are often the richest genealogical source available for a family with roots in the battle, because a claims examiner needed more than a name. He needed corroborating witnesses, usually neighbors who had known the applicant for decades, and their statements frequently included small human details that never would have made it into an official military record. An old wound that still ached in cold weather, a story a father told his children every year on the anniversary, a musket that stayed in the family for generations afterward and hung over a mantel long after the man who carried it had died. None of this means every family bearing one of these 14 names descends directly from the specific man who fought that day. Surnames spread widely across unrelated households, the same way Prescott or Warren or Little could belong to families with no connection to each other beyond sharing an English ancestor centuries removed from either side of the Atlantic. The only way to know for certain is the slow way, the documented way, working backward through town vital records, church registers, probate files, and those same pension applications, one generation at a time, until the line either connects to Breed's Hill or reveals itself to belong to an entirely different branch of the family tree. But for families who already carry some oral tradition of Revolutionary service, a grandparent's mention of an ancestor at Bunker Hill, a name half remembered from a family Bible, these 14 surnames are as good a starting point as exists anywhere in early American military history, backed by an unusually thick paper trail left by a country that wanted this particular afternoon remembered in detail. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.